Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. The saying goes that a wet and windy May fills the barn with corn and hay. Hopefully the old saying is true, but growers still have to get crops in a healthy state from now all the way up to harvest. Wet weather is also disease weather, and this couldn't be more true for septoria in wheat this year. The more showers there are, the more chances septoria has to spread up the crop canopy and into new growth. However, the cold weather has slowed growth recently and also the potential for the development of septoria. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr Stephen Kildea, a researcher in Teagasc Oak Park, who will be able to give us a steer on the septoria development, and also Ivan Whitten, a tillage advisor in Kildare, to give us an insight into wheat crops in his region. Ivan, can I first come to you? You predominantly work in North Kildare. Could you give us an idea of the prevalence of wheat in your area, the types of varieties farmers sow, and maybe the typical yields your clients achieve year on year?
I'm 25 years working up in North Kildare. Predominantly, the soil type up there, Michael, will be heavy in nature, so there will be a considerable acreage normally sown to winter wheat. And the autumn of 2020 was kind enough to facilitate that. So there's probably 60% of the area has been cropped to winter wheat, way above the previous year of 2019. The types of varieties that we would be looking at, Costello, Conross, Graham would be the mainstays. We'd still have a number of farmers growing JB Diego, a few people looking at Torp, and then we'd have a couple of growers looking at some of the newer varieties like Astronomer, Exitase and Saki. So that's where we are with varieties for 2021, Michael.
Give or take yields then, Ivan? What sort of yields are year on year guys coming up with?
Well, our first wheats up in Kildare, I suppose, look, we'll be aiming for around 11 tonne per hectare. I suppose continuous wheats one year, again, the other would vary between 9 to 10 and a quarter tonne per hectare. Depends on the year. It depends on the level of disease as well. Sure. The last 3 years, in terms of septoria levels and yield, has been look, the weather has been against us in terms of yield. Our 5-year averages have suffered, particularly when you're starting to do up fertilizer plans and looking at the previous 3 years for to get bonus nitrogen for winter wheats. You see that coming through. So hopefully, this harvest we will have a good winter wheat yield. Okay. What's there at the moment looks very, very promising.
I was going to say, and in terms of crops that are out there at the moment, how are they looking, and is there any great agronomic problems evident in the field at the moment?
Well, our sowing dates would vary. Like some of my clients on the larger acreages would have started sowing winter wheat from about the 25th of September, then moved into 2 and 6-row barley, and then back into wheat for a while before switching over to winter oats. And then, depending on the season, like there was a nice bit of wheat put in between the 20th of October into the early stages of November as well. So all in all, winter wheat, while it came through the winter slowly, it looks very, very promising now, to be honest with you. Okay. There's no major hiccups out there at the moment.
It's always great when you have a crop from ditch to ditch. It's always pretty good this time of the year. Stephen, could I come back to you just for a second? I just want to, in terms of disease, there was certainly some early disease activity in wheats, especially, I suppose, towards Ivan's area and maybe even a little bit further north. Maybe you might give us an idea about how those strategies worked in terms of disease control so far.
Yes, Michael. I suppose when you're talking about the diseases that would have been around at that, maybe about a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, yellow rust was on the mind, and we were talking a lot about yellow rust. And just as Ivan sort of described, some of those varieties, like your JB Diego, your Bennington, your Torp, there was quite a bit of yellow rust knocking around there. And that was probably coming through from that relatively cool, dry sort of spring that we had in February and March. And I suppose there would have been quite a few sort of pre-stem extension applications would have been put on those. You're talking an azole and maybe a strobilurine. And I think in the whole, they have worked quite well. And a lot of scenarios, would have been followed up then with a leaf tree application with a rust active with it in it. And I suppose looking at the trials we have here in Oak Park, we've a couple of trials that would have had yellow rust in them. And it has cleaned it up very well there. Now you can still see a bit of scarring in I suppose the lower base of the crop, but it's done quite a good job on those. Look, where I suppose bad choice of chemistry might have been looked at, maybe not a rust active out there, and maybe an application or poor application. There is instances where you might have a small bit of yellow rust potentially at the base of the crop, but on the whole, the yellow rust I think has been taken care of. Back about a month and a half ago, septoria was starting to creep in again. Wasn't huge levels, I think, at that stage, but look, we've had a change in the weather pattern, and that I suppose is where we're looking at going forward. It's septoria mainly.
Okay, we'll probably get to that in a few minutes. You mentioned, or Ivan, I just want to come to you, and Stephen mentioned a little bit about the kind of cold spring that we've had so far, and it's certainly delayed growth, and possibly, it interrupted the normal timings that a farmer would have had applying the main fungicides to wheat. How accurately do you think for the farmers you were dealing with, how accurately have they applied that main first fungicide to crops?
Michael, I suppose coming on from Stephen's comments there, like the cold April resulted in a lot of cold stress on crops from a point of view. When you're dealing with yellow rust, there was a lot of scarring in the varieties of Graham, for example, Thorpe, with no pustules appearing. Bennington did show pustules, but also that cold stress where there was on significant swings in temperatures at night time, there was a lot of actual scorching of crops there with CCC. Pre-May bank holiday weekend, the actual earlier sown wheat, they would have all received their standard T1 treatments centering around a Scara or a Dexa or maybe a Veligira, depending on the variety and whether it was prone to yellow rust or septoria or a combination of the two. I suppose post the May bank holiday weekend, because that leaf tree in the mid-October sown crops was a bit slower to come through, we then switched tack because the weather forecast was looking very iffy, and a lot of farmers at that stage then they would have went to some of the newer chemistry, looking at the likes of Revysol or the actual new Curative products centering around Inotreq. So look, people are sitting pretty good. Most people now know at this stage to be watching the emergence of that third last leaf and to be coating the actual at least 80% of the leaf as it's emerging.
So Ivan, just with that, would you say, and that leaf 3 timing is the critical kind of one, that leaf 3 is fully out, would you say that 80 or 90% of people got that right?
Oh, I would, yeah, without a doubt. Like the majority of my clients, for example, I suppose in simple terms, the leaf tree, the spraying of the leaf tree for the September sown crops would have taken place 5 to 7 days prior to that May bank holiday weekend. And for the mid-October onward sowing dates, they were applied probably around the 5th to the 7th of May, thereabouts, give or take a couple of days. And people switch tactics in terms of product, depending on the forecast, and given the fact, like April was good to tillage farmers from a point of view of septoria, because the septoria is our main disease. It's a wet weather disease, and we had a very dry, cold April, so it kept the actual levels of lesions down in the canopy. And like to move that forward, Michael, like speaking with Angela Ryan there in back west, and like on the variety trials there within the department, like it's down to location. Like there's considerably more disease pressure down in Moore Park, Kildare, than there is in back west. And like if you're looking at the untreated plots there last week, like we would have definitely the majority of our 4th last leaf very clean in the untreated, and probably 20 to 50% septoria in leaf 5, and leaf 6 starting to die away with the actual immature tillers dying away, starting to senesce now at this stage as well.
Stephen, Ivan mentioned a bit about the cold weather and about the leaf emergence and how that might also affect disease. Maybe you might explain to us how the cold weather and how leaves come out and how that affects the septorial life cycle, how that all kind of fits together, and should farmers be worried about septoria, if you like, catching up with our leaf emergence?
Okay, yeah, I suppose, look, Septoria, like ourselves, it's going to be very much dependent on weather and on temperatures and rainfall. And I suppose one of the critical things will, of course, be the rainfall. In May, we've had quite a lot of rain, a lot of wet days. But the temperature, as Ivan mentioned, is also very important in that it will slow down everything, not only the crop growth, but it will also have an effect on the septoria. Now, it's not a switch sort of where you have no growth or growth. It'll basically have a continuum where it'll slow down as temperatures decrease. As the temperatures go up during the day, the growth of it will also go up. So it will have a sort of a case in that, look, as the leaves are emerging, the activity of the septoria will be a little bit lower. But the counter to that will be that there has been sufficient rainfall, and the rainfall has not been, I suppose, a critical factor because there's been enough of that. There's been enough wet days. In fact, when you think about it, the temperature also will increase the amount of drying that will be occurring on the leaves and things like this, and this will affect the septoria development also in itself. So the drier the leaves, the less sort of development of septoria, less chance it has of infecting. And if the leaves are wet, then look, even though the temperatures are that little bit lower, your septoria will still also be able to take over and continue to develop. So look, we're probably looking, as Ivan mentioned, at sort of clean leaves, sort of 2, 3, 4 in some of the untreateds. But I'd be quite confident that there's quite a bit of infection in there in terms of latent that we cannot see just yet. And as temperatures increase over the next couple of weeks, that'll start to become evident. And that's where that leaf tree application is very important, because you're creating that barrier in terms of as the crop is growing. We've put this sort of barrier in place where it's more difficult for the pathogen to move up through the crop. And as that crop is starting to extend, it's also sort of exacerbating or multiplying that barrier effect. So it's very important. But what I would say is that, look, the one sort of factor that can often be critical is going to be that rainfall, and we've had an awful lot of it during May. So it would be a case that, as Ivan mentioned, we're moving from that cold, sort of dry April that didn't favour septoria into May that has absolutely favoured septoria.
So are we kind of gone then, Stephen, from a relatively low level of septoria into now, if you like, alarmingly high levels, or are we at that kind of alarm kind of rate as yet?
So I don't think it would be the sort of the levels per se. I think maybe we should be looking at it from a risk aspect, because if you look in a crop, and a lot of crops mightn't show very, very high visual amounts of septoria at this stage, and you say levels are potentially very low there. However, we do know that, look, how many spores, it only takes one spore to cause a lesion, and there's thousands upon thousands of spores within every lesion. So it's that risk aspect. And I would say that, look, as the period of rainfall continued over the last couple of weeks, the risk has increased. Now, that's where that leaf tree application becomes vital. And as Ivan sort of said, a lot of sort of crops would have had that leaf tree application before the weather broke, which is a big positive. So it sort of reduces the risk to some extent, but I would be looking at it, I would be saying that risk considerably increased the longer that wet period went on.
Okay. So Ivan, can I come back to you now just for a second? So lots of your farmer clients out there that have lots of winter wheat out there, and you mentioned other crops as well. The weather has been difficult over the last kind of 3 weeks, so lots of jobs, I suppose, are been stacking up, if you like. So the flag leaf spray or fungicide spray for our winter wheat is coming up, I presume, somewhere towards the middle or end of this week. But all the other crops need some sort of prioritization as well. How do you advise your clients in terms of getting the priorities about which one to attack first?
At this stage now, we definitely have to prioritize things. Where spring barley is in the pick, like we're looking at probably putting on a fungicide, a herbicide, plus or minus a wild oat spray to try and cut down on the actual amount of runs that you have to go through the crop. Primarily driven by the weather and the fact that the crop now is starting to meet in the rows. Top of that, I suppose, there will be some of the actual mid-October sown 6 and 2-row winter barleys have to be finished off in terms of their fungicides as well. So I suppose spring barley, winter barley will get priority ahead of winter wheat. And after winter wheat, then we probably move into winter oats. And if there are spring oats in there as well, that have to be looked at. Obviously, rape would have been taken care of from a point of view of sclerotinia before the weather broke. So like that's nearly put to bed now at this stage. So look, there's a lot to be done, Michael, and I suppose farmers need to be very conscious of what they're putting into the tank, and that those products are suitable for the crop that they're actually treating, because the last thing you want to be doing is treating a spring or a winter oat crop with a wild oat spray, for example, and making that mistake. Well, it's uncommon. When you're in a panic, accidents do happen.
So you're saying then, going back to the winter wheat, then you're kind of saying that the flag leaves won't be fully emerged for a little while yet, so there's no huge panic with winter wheat. So,
well, I suppose what I would be saying in a nutshell would be the September sown crops, as we're doing this podcast, their flag leaves were already done. They were done probably a week ago. In the week leading up to the end of May, the flag leaf in the majority of those crops are somewhere between 60 to 80% out. So we were hoping the weather would take up for the bank holiday weekend and we get a bit of sunshine because it's badly wanted. But there are other crops to be sprayed ahead of it. The majority of those mid-October sown crops, as we approach the June bank holiday weekend, will be probably 3 weeks sprayed. And like, if you look back, that they were treated at the leaf tree timing, 80% fully out, maybe 100% fully out. Leaf 2 then was 50% sprayed as well. So it's trying to build that barrier, as Stephen talked about, and trying to marry the T1 and the T2 together now, and combine the actual fungicide choices between the T1 and T2, and to also be conscious of resistance to septoria, and the fact that triazoles are dwindling, and there's a good shift there in the actual SDHI chemistry as well.
Stephen, just want to come back to you again for a second. In terms of the actives that are out there at the moment, there are certainly some new ones in the market at the moment, and you talked about a much higher risk as regards septoria for this main flag leaf spray. Given that threat that's there, are we now kind of narrowed into those new chemistries, and is that those the types of chemistries that farmers should be using with this flag leaf spray?
Yeah, look, as the month of May has gone on, it has turned into a septoria type sort of scenario. And Ivan sort of gives a very good overview of the decisions farmers are going to have to make over the next, I suppose, 10 days. Look, there's barley to be sprayed and things like that. And in terms of wheat, I suppose it is to look at what has gone past in the last couple of weeks, but also to look into the future, and to try to look into the future. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to protect that upper canopy from mainly, I suppose, at this stage, septoria or any other diseases that might be about. We're really talking about septoria. And we have to think that, look, we're going to try to protect this canopy as long as possible to capture grain fill. Like, the heads aren't out, we're not even thinking about that yet, but we need to start thinking about protecting the machinery that's going to fill those grains. So from the past, the risk has increased to septoria. So we're going to be looking at some level of curativity, definitely be required there. And then we're going to need that persistence to basically get us through to the point where we basically maximize grain fill. So if septoria is going to be the risk, and we are in the curativity scenario, and we also need a lot of strong protection in that, look, there's going to be quite a bit of septoria probably knocking around the base that could potentially lead to more infection later on. We have to start looking at those newer chemistries, and we're talking about the Revysol, and we're talking about the Inotreq sort of activity. The azoles, the older azoles, we do know, look, what they are at. We've known for the last few years that their activity has dwindled quite a lot. The SDHIs, look, moderate resistance, the SDHIs is absolutely dominating the population, and this does impact their efficacy. It has quite an impact on their efficacy over the last number of years. So it is a case that to get that curativity and to get that persistence that we require against septoria, we are going to require actives that include, say, Revysol or Inotreq. But also, of course, we need to be aware of what we're doing, look, and managing resistance to the best in that sort of scenario. The first thing, of course, will be to include that multi-site, and that's Fulpit now in this year. We'd be recommending Fulpit is included, and then also mix them with a different mode of action. So say with the Revysol, you are including something like an SDHI within that. I know those products contain fluoxaperoxide or Intrex, so it's important that they're used. And similarly then with the Inotreq, that you're including azoles in that, or an azole in that, to try and make sure that we protect these actives as long as possible.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Finally, Ivan, just want to come back to you for a second. You mentioned before that your farmer clients have various different varieties out there. Do you think there will be a little bit of mixing and matching in terms of these actives for the varieties that are there?
It's going to be, Michael, I suppose there's no definitive answer to that question. And I suppose the first thing that will go into all their tanks is a multi-site fulbit. Well, it's not actually as effective as Bravo or chlorothalonil. It has to be put in there from a septoria resistance point of view, and it's unaffected by resistance. And also, it has to take it's put in there to try and reduce the pressure on the high risk chemistry, whether it's the SDHIs or Revysol, the new triazole, or Inotreq, that new mode of action as well. So, like, farmers will be conscious of that, and after that, then they will try and rotate the chemistry as best as possible. But the two new products will definitely play a very, very important in this season septoria control, because it definitely is a perfect storm with the last 3 weeks being considerable amount of rain has fallen, in fairness.
Okay. And maybe we might end, Ivan, on a positive note, hopefully, if we can. How would you rate the yield prospects of winter wheat out there at the moment?
Well, given, I suppose, from a positive perspective, that the price of wheat has climbed considerably there in the last 6 weeks, and with prices there between 180 and 200 green proposed for next harvest, and in light of what's in the field there at the moment, I would hope that my clients and all Irish tillage growers out there with wheat or barley or oats in a field will be harvesting a good yield in the harvest of 2021.
Thanks very much, Ivan, and thanks very much, Stephen, for your time.
Best luck.
Thank you, Michael.
So that's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Ivan and Stephen for joining me today. There are a number of excellent webinars and upcoming events in the next few weeks, which you should pencil into your calendar. Teagasc are running a series of webinars on grass weeds as part of the ECT project. On June the 8th from Wexford with a focus on wild oats and canary grass. June the 22nd from the northeast with a focus on blackgrass and brome. And July the 6th from Cork with a focus on sterile brome, blackgrass and ryegrass. All of these events will start at 11:30 a.m. As I mentioned last week, we're in the process of planning the Oak Park Open Day at the moment, and that will take place on June the 29th, 30th and July the 1st. You can only attend by booking the Open Day first, and more details about this will be on the Teagasc website in the coming days. For all of these events, check out teagasc.ie/events. So finally, don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify, so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.